in the past few years, what events, patterns of injustice, discrimination, or hatred have impacted your community in particular? So let's go first to Dr. Joseph.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Thomas. It's an honor to be here. I would say that it's been a combination of things, but certainly I think that I'll go back. It's the 10th anniversary and say Trayvon Martin, because I think that Trayvon Martin and his passing in 2012 is going to be generative in positive and negative ways about sort of the state of hate and the challenges to building a beloved community. So we can connect it to mass incarceration, we connect it to public safety and social movements, rise of anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism. But I'd say that the killing of Trayvon Martin while he was just visiting his father in Sanford, Florida, is a generational tragedy that reverberates all the way to this day. And I just wrote something about the 10th anniversary, so I would say Trayvon Martin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joseph. And of course, I'm sure all of us as well are aware of the killing of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement really having a very visible moment in 2020. Next, let's go to Dr. Reyes.
Yeah, thank you for this question. No doubt, in speaking for the Asian American community, the greatest threat that we face right now is the rising anti-Asian racism, really catalyzed by the pandemic. And what we're experiencing right now is but the newest link in a long chain of anti-Asian racism in U.S. history. Asians have always been seen as the other, as yellow peril, as foreign threat, and in times of crisis, we're often scapegoated for societal troubles. And in our current situation for COVID-19, the Stop API Hate Reporting Center has now cataloged over 11,000 incidents of hate crime reported against Asians since the start of the pandemic in March 2020. Asian men and women have been brutally assaulted. They've had acid thrown on them. They've been slashed and stabbed by box cutters and more. Next week is the 1-year anniversary of the March 16th Atlanta shooting, in which a white man shot and killed 6 Asian women while shouting, "I want to kill all the Asians." This past January, Chinese American Michelle Go was pushed off of a New York train platform and killed by an oncoming train. Last month, in February, Christina Yuta Lee was followed home to her New York apartment and stabbed 40 times. So the attacks against Asian lives and dignity keep coming like unending waves. There's a lot of grief, a lot of rise in mental health struggles right now in the Asian American community. And so it's certainly something that we're continuing to figure out how to process and raise our voices on and address right now.
Thank you, Dr. Reyes. And then let's turn to Rabbi Blumofe.
Thank you, Dr. Yee, and I appreciate being here and give gratitude to the Veritas Forum as well for this invitation, and to you, Dr. Joseph, and you, Dr. Reyes. I appreciate being in collaboration and in thought with you as well. I think what I would just say in agreement with what has already been mentioned is the heightened pitch of public and elected officials regarding complicity or non-action regarding some of the incidents that have happened. And I know we'll get into this a little bit later, but certainly a very important moment for that was the statement of saying there's good people on both sides in Charlottesville, when and that was a really kind of a hit to the stomach. That idea of that higher pitch of this swirling about. We can certainly chronicle the unfortunate aspects of hate crimes against Jews in Europe, in Brooklyn, in the New York area, New Jersey. Certainly the acts of anti-Semitism that have happened here, specifically in Austin in the last few months, which have really alerted a community. Of course, the synagogue shootings in the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, the attempted, the hostage taking, the attempted takeover in Colleyville just a month or so ago. There's a lot that is brought the Jewish community into a bit of focus, as well as, again, as I mentioned, the rhetoric that have surrounded past events, but certainly current events regarding as we stand in solidarity with the victims of the war in Ukraine. There's certainly unfortunate conversations and definitions that have brought the Jewish people into a sense of alert.
All right, thank you to each of you for just sort of setting the stage for where we find ourselves in this cultural moment. I want to proceed in asking maybe questions that are specifically addressed to one of you, but that doesn't mean that only that one person can chime in on it. In fact, I really anticipate this as just being a conversation starter, and then other panelists, please feel free to chime in once that person has finished the initial response. So first, going to Dr. Joseph. In the 2020 protest movement following the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, it seemed that a cultural sea change, a racial reckoning, was underway. But in spring 2022, one wonders whether that sentiment has translated into reality and action. What is needed to make this promised change a reality? And what does your research on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. teach us about what now needs to be done?
Yeah, thank you. I do think that there's a change that's taking place and underway right now. I argue that this period is a period of reconstruction, America's third reconstruction. I have a new book coming out about this in September. But I think when we think about change is always a dialectical process. So I think that there's always movement and efforts at radical reconstruction. And by that, I mean this idea of looking upon America as a multiracial democracy. And the first time we did that is after slavery, after the Civil War. But there's also these forces of redemptionists, which are the forces of white supremacy, the forces in certain ways of Trump and MAGA. I think what Dr. Reyes was talking about with the proliferation of AAPI hatred and talking about COVID as the Chinese virus, that is really white supremacist sentiment. And when you have white supremacist sentiment, you're going to always have anti-Semitism. And you see that during the January 6th assault as well. So I think what we have to look at it is, and I think Dr. King did this very, very well, and Malcolm X in his own way, there are these forces, these reconstructionist forces that in 2020 really came to the fore. In a way, we bore the fruits of Black Lives Matter and social protest movements that had come into being a decade earlier, right? This idea of intersectionality, even though Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a critical race theorist at UCLA and Columbia, had been talking about intersectionality since 1989, Black feminists like obviously Angela Davis, but Beth Ritchie, Kathy Cohen, Ruthie Gilmore had been placing this in practice, thinking about the carceral state. And in some ways, their work was probably most popularized by Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow. And so in a lot of ways, what we saw in 2020 was sort of the culmination of this period of reconstruction that in some ways began with the election of Barack Obama, then followed by the death of Trayvon Martin and BLM, and then sort of this backlash, birther movement, Trump, MAGA. And then in 2020, all those forces sort of came to the fore together. There was a pandemic with racially disparate consequences. There was a rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism and anti-Asian Pacific Islander hatred and attacks and assaults and violence. There was a quest to reimagine public safety. Sometimes people call it defund the police, but there were many police riots and law enforcement riots against protesters and demonstrators that people saw from coast to coast. But also 15 to 26 million people came out in the context of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. We had over 2,000 separate protests in the United States and demonstrations. In the United Kingdom, over 260. So it became this global movement. We saw protests in Berlin and Germany. We saw it in Nigeria and other parts all over the world. I think we've seen a backlash over the last 2 years as well. voter suppression, anti-CRT, and the backlash comes from multiple forces. There's a grassroots white supremacist backlash. When we think about President Biden and his inauguration, where they had to send some law enforcement and National Guard home who they felt had ties to white supremacist groups. And in his inaugural speech, he talked about white supremacy and militia groups as a domestic threat, a terrorist threat. First time in American history any US president has done that, right? So I think what we have to think of is, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We've seen some good headway towards more equity and more justice in building the beloved community. And that's not necessarily just at the federal level. We haven't seen the passage of George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We haven't seen the passing of two different voter rights bill, the For the People Act, and also the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Bill. There's certain things that haven't happened. But the pandemic bill contained a lot of racial equity and justice, that pandemic bill, right? There's an infrastructure bill that has been passed. President Biden has signed a bunch of executive orders promoting equity in the federal government. So we have to take the good and the bad together and place it in a context, right? What we are facing is really the perpetual onslaught and backlash in terms of white supremacy and racial injustice. And part of that backlash is a narrative war that has gone on since the Civil War about how do we define what's actually happening to all of us in America, right? And one way of trying to define it is by lying about it and having myths of the lost cause, myths where you marginalize Black people and minorities and or Black people and people of color and women. But then you've had a pushback, and that is in Black studies and queer studies and Asian American Pacific Islander studies. Part of the Jewish prophetic tradition is here, Black social gospel traditions, radical queer and feminist traditions, right? And that's what you get with sort of the 1619 Project and sort of a new origin story, right? And so we're seeing this push and pull. On one level, the anti-CRT shows you that those who are redemptionists and opponents of multiracial democracy are running scared. The voter suppression shows you that too, that they can't win in a fair and ethical fight. That's the good news. The bad news is that you're being oppressed and marginalized and you're being silenced, right? So I think what we have to do is organize, share our stories, speak our truths, and be right there for wherever injustice is. I just wrote something, and I'll end on this, on Ukraine. And I stand with the Ukraine people, but I talked about the racism that Africans and Indians are facing in Ukraine. And I talked about the racist coverage that's where reporters were saying they felt more empathy for Ukraine because it was not Africa. It was not the Middle East, right? Some of this coverage has been anti-Semitic and anti-Black racist. So what do you mean? It's not Israel, it's not Palestine. So you can really feel, people have said they're blonde and blue-eyed, so I'm in tears. All of God's creatures count. We know this. We know this. It's axiomatic. It's been very discouraging to see people saying they're weeping for white children more than they would for children from the Middle East, children from Syria, right? Children from Africa, right? So we have to stand up for injustice, even when we're on the side of these victims of this human rights tragedy. So, like I said, I stand with the Ukrainian people, but we have to understand there are mixed race Ukrainian people too, right? I just want people to know it's not just African immigrants and Indian immigrants. There are people from Ukraine who have relationships with people who are not from the Ukraine, who are from all around the world. And we have mixed race people who are from the Ukraine, right? And who speak the language, the customs, and they're as Ukrainian as people with blonde and blue eyes. So we have to stand up for justice wherever we see injustice, and that's how we start.
Can I just come in for a minute just to respond to something Dr. Joseph mentioned? Just to your point, we're trying to find a way to offer a sense of solidarity, and we're going to some Ukrainian folk songs. And man, they all talk about the Cossacks, and the Cossacks were not good people. And so we're trying to find a way to show an authentic sense of connection, but recognizing the very troubled and turbulent past of Eastern Europe specifically, but generally, but Ukraine specifically. So I really appreciate your point. And I think if those of you who haven't caught it, I think Trevor Noah did a really interesting piece on the recognition of how people stand based on what they see, and how refugees, let's say from Ukraine, are even seen in an implicit bias from those from Syria or Africa as well. So it's just an interesting and very telling and very sobering thing to see. So really appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I'm grateful for the life and legacy of Dr. King, Malcolm X, and others. Dr. King, he spoke so much about cross-racial solidarity. And at its core, solidarity is standing up and showing up for people outside of your own community, right? And Dr. King, he cared about what was happening with Filipino laborers in the fields in California. I mean, he had correspondence with Cesar Chavez, caring for what was happening in the Latino community. He went to India and spoke with Gandhi and brought so much of the notions of ahimsa and nonviolent peaceful resistance back with him to the civil rights movement here. And so just thinking through, like, what does cross-racial solidarity look like in our day and time? Ultimately it can't be about any sort of shared interest or shared commonality because we look the same or we live our lives the same way, or because we're in some sort of moral proximity to one another, but rather because every person is made in the image of God, because we have a shared humanity. So whether they're in the next neighborhood over, or they're in Ukraine, whether they're Black, brown, and white, we have to care because these are fellow image bearers, fellow humans, we have a long way to go to get to that point, right? As Dr. Joseph was saying, that we need to care about blonde-haired, blue-eyed children as much as we do Black and brown children. And we need to care about the wars in Africa and India as much as we care about the wars in Europe and so on. And so, but I think that the more we can truly see the divine in one another, the more that we can truly see the image of God in one another, the more authentic and the deeper our pursuit of solidarity will be.
Well, and Dr. Reyes, we saw that in 2020. I think one of the missed opportunities of post-2020 is that the American democratic order was not healthy enough for the 81 million who voted for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party to enact real substantive changes at the federal level, right? It just was not insane. And that's a problem of a sclerotic democracy and not the American people in that sense, right? Because they basically voted the most popular votes in American history for real substantive change. And, that change includes, investing in communities, ending racial segregation and economic inequality and the wealth gap, absolutely ending hate and violence, and really policing white supremacists and hate mongers who should be policed instead of punishing, poor people, and putting undocumented folks in detention camps where their kids can die and they can be raped and sexually trafficked. So we always, and this is my job as a historian, is to remember, right? And I'm always in solidarity with other groups who want the world to remember, whether we're talking about the Holocaust or we're talking about, aspects of South Asian history, wanting us to remember these devastating things that impacted the communities, because if we forget, they are bound to happen again. That's why we say that. So we can't ever forget that in 2020, we really we saw it on the streets of America and globally, the deep cross-racial solidarity. And, Dr. Reyes, I would say that what's interesting about Dr. King, he defines that cross-racial, that multiracial solidarity as not really about standing with people outside of your community. He defines those people as part of his community. That's when Dr. King talks about the world house. And, he talks about, I'll give you a story. When he's in India, when he's in Kerala in India, they introduce him as a part of the caste system, as an untouchable. And he says initially he's taken aback. He said, what? He's being introduced as an American untouchable. And then he says, the more I thought about it, the more I said, he's right. I am an American untouchable. So King's whole life was about trying to make us see there was really no separation. You know what I mean? So there was no separation. So you could have, a PhD, Atlanta, Georgia, and come from this great family, but you really were connected to the so-called, untouchables, right, in India. And you were proud to be, right? So part of what we saw when you saw so many multiracial, and yes, so many white people out in the streets globally, we really achieved in those moments a kind of really transcendent cross-racial solidarity, including protests in white towns that were 90 and at times 99% and 100% white. Certainly we had, Jewish sisters and brothers in solidarity, but we had Muslims in solidarity, Catholics, Hindus, agnostic. We just had faith-based and secular communities in solidarity. So it's important for us to remember, what does solidarity look like? We saw it in the streets of America in 2020. We saw it in Austin in 2020. And within that solidarity, we saw law enforcement, police shot out the eyes of people all throughout the United States. People lost their eyes where people were shooting rubber bullets at them, right? We saw an elderly man in Buffalo get his skull fractured by the police who knocked him down because he was in solidarity with Black and brown and white protesters. So we have to remember that we saw a massive, unprecedented solidarity. And what we're trying to figure out is that why that solidarity has not translated into even bigger substantive changes. And I'll say, especially in the United States, because we saw it, right? And remember, that solidarity translated into 81 million votes before the January 6th white supremacist assault on the US Capitol. So we always have to remember, and that's what I do. History is obsessed with what happened, right? So what happened in 2020 was glorious, and it was a political reckoning. And on some levels, it shows you that, there are great people in America and very good people in America of all races, of all backgrounds, of all sexual orientations, everything, able, non-able. But that didn't translate into the kind of changes people wanted and demanded on the ground, right? And that has to do with larger problems in our democracy that we're all facing, deep partisanship, voter suppression, big money and oligarchy, anti-Black racism, the AAPI hate, the willingness to invest more in punishment than systems of nourishment and environmental justice and social justice, right? And we're seeing it now with the narrative of crime waves, narratives of we need more money for police, we need more money for military, we need more money for instruments of war and violence that Dr. King decried at Riverside Church in New York City on April 4th, 1967. So it's important that we don't forget the beauty we saw in 2020, because we saw a lot of beauty even amidst all that death. We saw so much beauty, but we've not necessarily been able to translate that beauty into the kind of fundamental change that we saw during the New Deal and the Second World War and these epical moments in American history and world history.
Thank you very much to all panelists and to Dr. Joseph. I want to turn now to Dr. Reyes and maybe start to touch on some of the sources for this pushback that Dr. Joseph is talking about. So, Dr. Reyes, you approach this conversation not only as an Indian American yourself, but also as a Christian organizational leader with the Asian American Christian Collaborative. Now, sadly, the loudest critics of racial justice today often seem to be from Christian voices, invoking theological concepts and rhetoric from the Christian faith. What are reasons for this Christian resistance to racial justice, and what is your response from a Christian theology of social justice and racial justice?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. What we see in our society today is Christians fighting Christians, not just over the issue of whether racism is a sin or not, as if there was a debate on two sides, but whether the Bible, whether God's word actually calls us to address the problems of race and racism. And what's happened, and I'm sure many here today have seen, is that whenever there's a racial tragedy, from the murder of George Floyd to the murder of 6 women in the Atlanta massacre last year, that there are some, not all, but some churches and some Christian leaders that turn their back on the situation and say something to the effect of, let's just focus on the gospel. And what they mean when they say that, let's just focus on the gospels, let's just focus on our doctrinal beliefs, on a certain list of theological statements that we hold to be true, and let's focus on getting people to believe in Jesus, as if only people believed in Jesus, then things like racism would go away. And the problem, of course, is that it's been Christians, people who claim the name of Jesus, who have been on the front lines of perpetuating racism throughout human history. And so simply believing in Jesus and holding to a list of 8 to 10 doctrinal, theological statements will not automatically cure the brokenness of humanity. And so I like to go back to these folks. Part of the work that we do at the AACC is wanting to equip churches to rethink these statements and what they mean by them, and to go back to folks saying this and say, okay, let's talk about this for a second. Let's look at the life of Jesus and the quote gospel that he proclaimed and see what he meant. And I know that the term gospel, it's a complicated term, and if it can sound like Christianese, if you will, but the gospel simply is translated as good news. When Jesus came, he brought good news, and short and simple, this good news was holistic restoration. Not only did Jesus come to restore our relationship spiritually with God, which I think people sometimes get so focused in on just that, like we just need to care about people's state of salvation. But he also came to restore us physically and emotionally, spiritually, even socially. And I think we forget that. You see, when Jesus enters the scene of human history, he invites people to follow him, to believe in him, but he also heals people. He heals the blind, the lame, the deaf. He goes to the outskirts of cities and then restores people back into society. He cares about their socioeconomic standings, and speaks truth to power. He addresses those in power and talks about the oppression that they're bringing. And so not only that, but Jesus himself was a brown-skinned Jewish man, and I love to highlight the fact that he has mixed ancestry. If you look at his genealogy in Matthew 1, I mean, the 4 women mentioned, he has Moabite, Canaanite, Hittite heritage. So Jesus was mixed. And we can glean from this that when we see his stories in the Bible, that he experienced racial slurs. He experienced racial antagonism, and he goes out of his way to reach people of other cultures in their own context, in their own language, to love them and care for them. So, when I hear Christians saying, let's just focus on the gospel, I said, this is the good news. It is holistic restoration, caring about making all things new. And that includes seeing people with their skin color, their racialized experiences, the hate that they've received, and caring about that just as much as we care about their spiritual state. So if Jesus cared about that, then we should as well.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Reyes. And Dr. Joseph, I was wondering if either from your own journey and your own spiritual background, or perhaps from the perspectives of Dr. King and Malcolm X as men of faith, if you had any response to that.
Oh, yeah, no, I thought what Dr. Reyes said is brilliant. And certainly I grew up a Christian in New York City, a Black Baptist church, Southern Black Baptist by way of a New York City storefront. So it's very interesting my path. I think that the idea of the Black social gospel is really, really important here, and the way in which Dr. King is coming out of a Black social gospel tradition. And when we think about that social gospel tradition, this idea of thinking about the Bible and thinking about Christ as a social justice activist, and thinking about him as an anti-racist, and thinking about him as somebody who's against mass incarceration and police brutality and racial and economic oppression is very, very powerful. And I think that in a lot of ways, the Black social gospel is what provides Dr. King the ballast. And he's getting this from Dr. Benjamin Mays, Howard Thurman. So many people are connecting that Black social gospel to aspects of Gandhian nonviolence, and people like Bayard Rustin, people like A.J. Musty, people like William Worthy, folks like Jim Farmer of the Congress of Racial Equality and the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and efforts at interracial solidarity. The first freedom rides were in 1947-48 in the Upper South with Bayard Rustin, before the 1961 freedom rides that go into the Deep South. And so I think that Dr. King has a very muscular Christianity and a strong faith, but I think Malcolm X does too. I think we don't look at Malcolm X as this person of faith. And it's interesting because Malcolm is coming initially out of a Christian tradition. His father is a Black Baptist preacher, itinerant, and also a follower of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, the Jamaican activist and organizer of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which started the largest Black mass movement in really world history. Over 5 million people are part of the UNIA. And so on multiple continents, and there's aspects of Indian activism in the UNIA when we think about UNIA activism in the Caribbean, where it's a very big mixed Black, Indian, indigenous, Asian society. Think about Trinidad, and you think about aspects of Jamaica and aspects of Nevis, and just different Grenada, so many different cultures. So I would say that what's so interesting about Dr. King said that Sunday church service was the most segregated hour in America. And when we think about even the dawn of evangelical Christianity, you had folks like Billy Graham who really didn't come out against white supremacy the way they could have in the 1950s, and became really tools of and corollaries of white supremacy by the 1960s and 70s. And when we think about the Christian Coalition and sort of this idea of right-wing Christianity, there's got to be a big pushback against that. And Dr. King did that pushback. And, Malcolm is a Muslim who's trying to think about the Muslim faith and sort of global Islamic faiths as something that's going to be pro-human rights, that's going to be anti-racist, that's going to be anti-oppression. And I think when you look at Malcolm near the end of his life, he is forming all these sort of diplomatic and religious ties, both in Africa and the Middle East. And he's really on some levels coming close to aspects of what Dr. King is doing. And where I say coming close is in this sense, they're both revolutionaries. Dr. King is a radical Christian, nonviolent, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, anti-capitalist, at least racial capitalism, human rights champion. That's who Dr. King is. And Malcolm is this global Islamic faith and secular leader for a human rights revolution as well. So it's just very, very interesting. And I do think religion is a big part of what we're going to have to transform. And how do we define faith communities? And in the United States, the kind of popular faith communities that have been radicalized and politicized are really espousing and articulating beliefs a lot of times that are antithetical to the core beliefs of the faith they claim to represent, right? And how do we how do we say that in positive ways?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Joseph. I want to bring you in here, Rabbi Blumofe, and so bring a Jewish perspective into the conversation. So Jewish identity stands at this special, perhaps even unique crossroads of being both an ethnicity and a faith. And could you speak to how the anti-Semitism is both racially and anti-religiously motivated? And is it even possible to separate these two?
Thanks, Dr. Yee. I appreciate it. And I just wanted to, perhaps we can continue this discussion that we've been having with Dr. Reyes and Dr. Joseph. In addition to leading a community, a congregation, a synagogue, I teach at the Seminary of the Southwest, an Episcopal seminary here in Austin. And I teach a class with my good friend, Reverend Dr. Dan Jocelyn Siemiatkowski, about undoing anti-Judaism in the church. And while there are very important and very worthy aspects, Dr. Reyes specifically, that you mentioned lyrically about Jesus, unfortunately, the way that the way that Christianity was constructed is that it's very easy to see that baked into this, and following some of the writings of David Nierenberg, that there is an anti-Jewish bias, to say the least, in the construction of Christianity, and certainly in Islam as well. For a lot of reasons, perhaps. And so I think, Dr. Yee, when you asked the question, I think as we begin to think about who we are, and we might have a sense of vertigo with critical race theory, or who we are, what we are, and all of that is certainly in play, and to want to appreciate the intersectionalities and the multi-realities that we all possess. The idea of religion, I do agree, Dr. Joseph, that we're going to have to figure that out and reconstruct, to use your words, that as well, because it's always something to see the students in week 2 or week 3 of the classes to read something, let's say, by Paul, let's say Romans also, and to sort of say, wait a second, we're not just talking about texts in a theoretical way. There is a Jewish person here. This is a real construct. This is a real, this has real consequences for us. And I think that there is movement. It's not just a promise that cannot be addressed. For example, a couple of years ago, we were speaking about some of the fraught nature of, I don't want to get too wonky, but some of the fraught nature of the Good Friday liturgy. And it was pretty uncomfortable conversation about, convert the Jews. What does that mean? What is it? And I asked the class, and I asked, well, why don't we just change this? In Judaism, it's a little bit easier perhaps to do that. I was laughed at. However, this year in 2022, the authorities in the Episcopal Church in Texas, at least, have okayed an alternate liturgy of Good Friday, put together by my dear friend, Dr. Jocelyn Siemiatkowski, because he took my cry of pain, he took the cry of my heart seriously. And so if we have responsive connections, and we were speaking about this before, but there's a story that I've told before, but I think it's a very important story for us. 2 people were sitting together, let's say at a bar, and one friend asked the other friend, "Do you love me?" And the second friend, "Of course I love you. What are you talking about? Of course I do. Are you filming this? Like, what are you doing? Like, of course I do." And then deeper into the evening, the first person says to the second, "Well, you love me. Do you know what causes me pain? Do you know what causes me hurt?" And the second person's like, "How do I know? No, we text, we go out, we do stuff, but I don't know your inner life. I don't know your life." And the first person says to the second person, "Well, in order to love me, in order to have a friendship, you need to know my pain. You need to know what hurts me." And I think that aspect of really authentically diving deeply into someone else's reality and sharing in a vulnerable way allows us to really think about that. And I think the construction of Judaism, the unfortunate aspect that I've spoken about recently too, is there was a story going around in 18th and 19th century Europe, where Jewish families would, under their bed, keep a suitcase that was packed always. And the story was, for the children, well, then the Messiah could come at any minute. You want to be ready to go to wherever the Messiah is. However, there's a real political angle to that story, which is you never know if you're going to be able to be in your house. There could be a knock on your door at any moment. And any of the authorities, ranging the political spectrum, could say the Jews are no longer wanted here. So while there are prophetic traditions that are very important that do help and aid and amplify messages, for Jews to feel at home is really something I think we're still trying to figure out. And I think having a conversation about racial equity, about gender and disabilities, we also must have a conversation about religion. But that too, I think that's a third rail, to use a Northeastern term. That's a difficult thing, because once you start sort of shaking that tree, there's some really intensive blowback that one might get. So I think that it is unfortunately an incrementalist move, but one done with beautiful allies who trust each other and can help each other. So I think that the idea of being at the nexus or the intersection, if we will, of race and religion is something that I don't think we've certainly figured out, because the hatred or the suspicion or the alienation of the Jew goes back far longer than the construction of race.
Thank you, Rabbi Blumofe. And just to follow up on that a little, we mentioned Ukraine earlier, more from a racial perspective, but my understanding is that in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that there's also an anti-Semitic angle involved as well.
Yeah, well, I think that, if you're following this, some of the rhetoric that was used by Putin to try to denazify, so-called to denazify the area, hits really hard when the leader of Ukraine is Jewish. Zelensky himself, who lost 3 of his 4 grandparents in the Shoah, in the Holocaust. And that idea of sort of the cynical appropriation of what that means causes a sense of fear. It causes a sense of, well, who are we, and where do we belong in this story? Where is the path towards justice? This is a place that, as we talked about before, is a very fraught place where Jewish ghosts and also Jewish accomplishments ring quite far in Ukraine, and there's a real sense of opening that wound of trauma, and specifically last week when there was bombing, the memorial at Baba Yar, where tens of thousands of people were shot in just a few days, is a case in point about how symbolic, as well as when real people are suffering, how symbolic this land is as well. So I do believe that in many ways the hatred of Jews does predate racial constructs. And just to sort of bring it into a more theological point, and maybe a more of a mystical point, our tradition, the Jewish tradition, teaches that we have a choice. We can look at things as if they were a void, V-O-I-D, as something that was so wholly different from us, or if we could look at things or people or events as a mirror. How do we find ourselves? Where is the confirmation? Where's the humanity that is shared, as Dr. Reyes so elegantly said before, seeing each other b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. So the idea that we could give up on people and sort of say that is so other, the alterity of what that is has no relevance to me. And yet we should look at things with a mirror eyes to see, even though this is a very fraught thing and we have to wade through horrible rhetoric, we have to sort of address the things that are hard-baked within our own sense of the world and what others might be, whether it's or a drawing room anti-Semitism or otherwise. I think to look at life with a mirror really does amplify this prophetic tradition of really knowing that it's really difficult, but yet endeavoring to go on and going on in such a coalition in order to actually make a difference. And one can't do that alone. So I think the fact that we're modeling this conversation today, and I know certainly that we all reach out across our communities and to seek out ways that we can get stronger together, I think is a really important lesson of how to forestall people who use language in a bankrupt and negative way.
I was just going to say amen.
Okay.
Amen to that.
And let me just want to say one more thing, if you don't mind me saying. And it's not just y'all got to do something. It's something that on my own as well. So I do a lot of work in the jazz community in Austin. And one of the most painful books I've read lately is a book, I think, Dr. Joseph, by Gerald Horne. who's a wonderful scholar at Rice University, who wrote a book called Jazz and Justice, Racism and the Political Economy of the Music. And we're all, it opens up a lot of important yet very painful aspects of the Jewish experience in America, in relationship and in antithetical relationship to the African-American experience in America too. So I'm not just saying, hey, look at what I've got. I need to delve deeply into the truths that I think I hold and know that we're not there yet, and that we need to be deliberate and precise about working together. And it's something that's generational and that we can model for those who are looking at us.
All right, thank you, Dr. Blumofe. Rabbi Blumofe. As a reminder to the participants, if you could please submit any questions that you have in the Chasm Suggest tab. I'd love to start tabulating those, and we'll enter in the Q&A soon. But what I'd like to do is just ask another question, sort of in closing, to all the panelists, and this really pertains to the subject for today's gathering. So how can we cultivate cross-cultural coalitions advocating for racial justice? I feel like we've said various things about this, and maybe just try to draw those threads together. And specifically, what hurts, barriers, or tensions between our communities might need to be voiced, processed, and perhaps even forgiven in order to partner together?
Well, I'll start because I have to leave hard out at 8. I think what we need to do is think about this idea, the struggle for Black equality and Black dignity and citizenship. Because I think, Isabel Wilkerson wrote a wonderful book called Caste. And when you think about the United States and really globally, anti-Blackness is the organizing principle of that caste system, right? And so if we're ever going to get out of all these isms, including racism, even with what Rabbi Blumofe said about anti-Semitism sort of predating the social construction of race, I think to get out of anti-Semitism too, we need to achieve Black dignity and citizenship, both in the United States and the world over. That would be a reordering of the caste system. And it's not going to leave, when we do that, and if we achieve that, we're not going to leave queer people or indigenous or people of color behind. We're really not. So I think for people who are not Black, thinking about the solidarity, and Heather McGhee calls it the solidarity dividends, when you become an anti-racist, in her wonderful book, The Sum of Us, right? Where we had white communities would rather, they filled in swimming pools so they couldn't be desegregated. So segregation costs all of us, at least all regular people, because most white people are actually not oligarchs. They're not millionaires and billionaires across the world. They're suffering too. People of color suffer disproportionately, and Black people in a lot of ways the most when we look at the data. So a lot of what we need to do is figure, and I think in 2020, we sort of came closest to this. People were trying to find out about not just Black history, but Black history as American history, and then where their history fit in that. Because what's interesting about when you study Black history and you look at something like the 1619 Project, Jews and Latinx and queer people and Asian and South Asian folks all are in that history. Mexican and Mexican Americans. There's a great new book by Kelly Lytle Hernandez that I'm reading in galleys called Bad Mexicans, about the Mexican Revolution and imperialism and race, and gives you a much different understanding of like what's going on when we think about undocumented and the way the United States has used Mexico historically, starting in the 19th century, to pillage and invest and plunder and super exploit. My colleague Monica has the wonderful book about The Injustice Never Leaves You, about lynching in Texas, and the Texas Rangers lynching Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And these are the histories they don't want us to know. It's not just sort of Black history they don't want us to know, all these histories. And we've got deep histories of anti-Semitism here. We've got deep histories of misogyny and queerphobia and transphobia here, anti-Black racism. But I think the positive of 2020 was when you were seeing these Black feminist and queer activists connected to BLM saying we had to center the least of these, right? We were centering this idea of all Black lives mattering, right? This idea that we weren't going to leave behind Black, poor, and queer, and trans, and HIV positive, and disabled, and mentally challenged folks behind. So I think we all, when we all get behind, and I think, you saw aspects of this during the civil rights era when you think about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Dr. King, and Julian Zelizer has a wonderful small biography of Rabbi Heschel, and it's very, very interesting that by pushing for Black citizenship and dignity, we sort of all win, but at the same time, the backlash and the narrative of the lost cause, including its current iteration as anti-critical race theory, convinces people the exact opposite. They convince us that if you can just keep Black people down, you're going to be able to have your place. And it doesn't just convince white people, it convinces everybody along that caste system. So when we think about that caste system, Derek Bell said the Black people were the faces at the bottom of the well. And then there's going to be people intermediate. There's going to be intermediates, sometimes honorary whites. We think about the difference between how Cubans are treated by the US government as opposed to Haitians and people from other places, right? And so I think what we need to do, and this is tough because it means identifying so deeply with people who you might have been taught are not part of your community, right? It means identifying that deeply and understanding that their struggle is your struggle, and vice versa. But I still think we need that because the narratives of diversity and multiculturalism that we have are not enough. It's really been a struggle for Black equality, not because Black people are so special. It's because Black people have faced such very specific circumstances, starting with racial slavery. And in a lot of ways, everything Black people have experienced since racial slavery is reflective of the badge of indignity and violence that slavery represented. And that's the so when you think about segregation and mass incarceration, convict lease systems, these are continuing markers of racial slavery. That's what they are. You know what I mean? So you never ended that system. And that's why Black people can be disproportionately overrepresented in every single negative social economic indicator in the United States and underrepresented in all the positive. It's not because somehow genetically or phenotypically something's wrong with us. And it's not about our behavior. It's about deep, deep structures of violence and inequity that have contoured and structured the entire society. So one of the reasons why we have problems doing interracial, transracial, cross-racial coalitions is that people kind of also don't know how would the world look if we didn't scapegoat this group. You know what I mean? Like, how does it look? How does it look where Black people are not the people who are considered criminals and are considered ignorant and lazy and shot by the police and they deserved it. And they're not on corporate boards and they're not part of venture capital or private equity or Wall Street or hedge funds. How does it look when that's no longer the case? And that's the big fear that people have. So if you ask me, what we're looking for is how do we get to Black dignity and citizenship? And Baldwin said it, if we ended anti-Black racism, Baldwin says in The Fire Next Time, we're going to finally have a chance to, what Baldwin says is achieve our country, right? And that's what I think we should do.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Joseph, for your contribution and for your insights tonight.
Thank you. I'm signing off, but thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Reyes, Rabbi Blumofe, and Dr. Yee. Thank you.
All right. Now turning to Dr. Reyes or Rabbi Blumofe.
Sure, I can add to that. I appreciate everything that Dr. Joseph said. I also would add that when it comes to the conversations on cross-cultural solidarity, we do also need to keep in mind a global perspective as well. I think sometimes we get so focused on racism within the United States, racism within U.S. history, I think sometimes we get stuck into that black-white racial divide in which then Asians, Latinos, Jewish peoples, indigenous mixed folks can often get forgotten. I think about even my mother's own story and experiences of her great-great-grandparents being brought as forced laborers by the British Empire from India to Uganda to build the railroad for the British Empire in Uganda and Kenya, and then having to flee during the dictatorship of President Idi Amin because of the genocide that he was waging against Indians and other minorities in Uganda, and flee as refugees with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And my mom eventually making it to the US. I think about Cambodian refugees, Hmong refugees, so many folks that are fleeing dictatorships, authoritarian governments, coming as asylum seekers and more from around the world. How can we make space at the table for all of these different sorts of experiences of pain, racism, oppression? So that's one comment. I think another thing is that just historically, as ethnic minorities, we don't always know how to do cross-racial solidarity well, because on the one hand, it's hard to care for and help other folks and their burning homes when we feel like our own home is burning. There's so much exhaustion and grief, and it can be paralyzing. On the other hand, there's also this mentality of scarcity that says, if I advocate for someone else, that means that less resources and attention will be given to me or my people. And I want to just hone in for a moment on the history of the Black and Asian community, because we need to talk about this more. Because I still remember in the wake of the Atlanta shooting last year, taking to social media, just posting about how I was grieving, how the AAPI community was grieving, and people reaching out to me and saying, you're taking up too much space to talk about Asians right now. You're taking up too much space to be grieving about these 6 Asian women. Don't you know that the Black community is hurting? Don't you know that the Latino community is hurting? And my response was, yes, but 6 women were just murdered. Like, where is the space for us all to grieve together? And there's space for all of our grief and to not be in competition with each other. And so on the one hand, there's this long and complicated history of tension between Black and Asian communities. The 30th anniversary of the LA riots is this year. And Asians have not done well historically in standing up for the Black community. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that Asian immigrants come to the US and they're taught to just keep your head down, don't rock the boat, don't challenge the status quo in any way. And many Asians even admit that they are terrified of coming to this country and being treated the way that Black people are treated by white folks. So they stay silent and they don't advocate, and we don't necessarily have all these historic models for advocacy. And it's complicated because in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, one of the officers was an Asian officer. And then on the other hand, so many of the hate crimes committed against Asians, specifically Asian women, are by Black men. So this cuts both ways, and we need to address all of this while making space for each other to grieve and mourn. And so, long story short, our communities need to be spiritually and culturally formed by cross-cultural solidarity. We need to be regularly hearing from our leaders why we must care for each other. Our communities need to see this modeled better through conversation panels like this one, as well as people doing the work on the streets. And when a community is hit, the rest of us need to be asking ourselves, how can, not only reaching out to leaders and saying, how can we help? What do you need? But also, how can we grieve with you? How can we pray with you in the spirit of Rabbi Blumhof's story of like, how are you suffering right now? How can I enter into that space of suffering and mourn with you and make that practice of communal Lent in equal space with communal activism?
Thanks, Dr. Reyes, for your beautiful wisdom and your hopeful vision. And, I know the prophetic words of Isaiah, who talked about this tent that would expand based on the community of, let's call it the beloved community that would be built. And certainly in the work that I do in a synagogue, I have seen over the 20 plus years I've served this community, that opportunity to actually put that into practice and to withstand some of the withering criticism when one would stand up for someone, because there becomes very political and very thorny. Well, where were they for us, et cetera, et cetera. So that calls into question, and that calls into a really important motto that I've taken on from my dear teacher and friend, Dr. Colette Pierce Burnett, who's retiring this year from Houston Tillotson University. And she says, let's avoid the victimization Olympics. Let's just stop. And that's a very powerful statement. And it kind of, at least for me, stops me in my tracks. So yes, know my suffering, know my story, know what keeps me up at night, and know what I'm aspiring to be, know what I can do. Know that just like any good teachers, and both of you are amazing teachers, I'm sure, it's not about scarcity, but what happens when you empower your students to learn? And what happens, what's that feeling you get as a teacher when your student takes what you teach them and advances it in an inspiring way? So yes, it's about doing real work with people, and not just, if I'm going to have a panel with somebody, we're not just going to talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Yeah, I mean, that's important. It's really important. And yet we can't have a narrow idea of what we should be saying, and we're canceled if we don't say that. The idea is that we're all human beings with a multiplicity of voices. And the importance is of getting to know. And just like in any loving relationship, you deal with certain things that may not be amazing in order to further the relationship that brings a sense of joy and possibility. So I choose the mirror and not the void, and the ability to be able to stand and to get to know and to make mistakes and to invest in ways that, that one would want to see that holy or beloved community together. So if we're all recognizing that we're camping, we realize that it is intense. That's a joke, but it is intense for sure. But the idea that we're not being able to claim the land, there's no endowment, there's no legacy that we can hold, that we can hold on to. Rather, it's those who are coming, watching our example, watching our modeling, who may, God willing, be able to be inspired by what we do, to be able to share a really interesting, unexpected journey of improvisation into a sense of building coalition in a holy way with respect in ways that are presented.
All right. Thank you so much, Rabbi Blumofe. So I think with that, we can move officially into the question and answer period. So again, please submit your questions into the Suggest tab in Chasm. I want to take the moderator privilege and go ahead and ask the first question. And actually, returning back to pick up on a thread that Rabbi Blumofe raised earlier. And I wonder, Dr. Reyes, if you could speak to it. So Rabbi Blumofe had talked about, this sense that there's baked into the cake of Christianity, this supersessionism towards Judaism that certainly fuels some of this tension when it comes to allyship, when it comes to solidarity. And so, Dr. Reyes, your book, Becoming All Things, taking that title from a line in Paul where, among other things, he says, I became as a Jew to the Jew. And so I wonder if you just have a response to maybe whether there are resources in the Christian faith to try to bridge this gap.
Yeah, this is so interesting. I actually was on a phone call earlier today with another author who was writing about Jesus, and he said that he received feedback from his editor at this publishing house saying that they were concerned about his description of Jesus because he sounded too Eastern. And to which his reply was, but Jesus was Eastern. And, I think it is such a depiction or a reflection of where white evangelical Christianity has come. So many of us, I grew up Christian community, Christian school, church, and I'm very familiar with, and many people are, that portrait from Walter Salmon, the portrait of Christ. It's this picture of a very fair-skinned Jesus looking off into the distance with light brown hair and this halo around his head. I grew up reading children's Bibles where everybody, it didn't matter if they were Egyptian, Cushite, Hittite, or Jewish. They all had the same fair skin color. And you sort of just grow up in this reality that everybody in the Bible was somehow white, that they looked like us in the 21st century US American context. And it just deprives us of any sort of cultural awareness, cultural intelligence towards the people in the Bible, the people of the first century world, of the vibrancy of cultures there, including the vibrancy of Jewish peoples of the first century world, right? I mean, you mentioned Paul being one type of Jewish man, a Pharisee, part of the educated elite, studied under Gamaliel, but there was also Sadducees, there was the Jewish diaspora. There was all sorts of bicultural, multicultural mixings with Samaritans and others. I mean, a vibrancy of cultures and peoples, and we haven't been taught about this well, and so I think so many of our assumptions, even anti-Jewish postures and interpretations stem from this really anemic understanding of the beauty of peoples and cultures and the Jewish peoples in Scripture. And so I'm a big advocate for truly seeing Scripture in color, for pastors, for teachers, religious leaders, Christian leaders, in front of their congregations, whether it's from the pulpit or elsewhere, to actually, whatever passage they're in, to map out the ethnicities of the people that they're talking about, to find it on the map, to talk about their culture, their language, their dress, because these things matter. And when we lack that cultural awareness, we end up going down this path towards ignorance, and ignorance is what leads to judgmentalism, criticism, othering, and ultimately then leads to hate. And so that is the cycle that we need to break, and cultural intelligence plays a huge role in that.
I'm happy to respond, Dr. Yee, if you want me to.
Oh, please do.
I mean, Dr. Reyes, I think that's spot on, and that path of least resistance, because our lives are so uncertain, economically and socially and culturally, and people really want to hold on to a truth that maybe they were taught in school or taught in childhood, and to begin to interrogate those truths or to interrogate those pictures of the children's Bible is really difficult. So I don't want to minimize somebody's sense of self. And yet, I agree with you that this idea of not doing that will just keep where we are in play. And I think in order to advance in a way that is suitable for this cross-cultural building of beloved community, I think that is a very, very, those are important conversations to have. And then I appreciate too, whether it's the scholar Shai J.D. Cohen or many others who talk about the Judaisms of the Levant and of ancient Judaism. It's a really amazing understanding of how varied and how interesting, even going to Christianity, the Dead Sea Scrolls and who wrote them and where they come from. And it's a really wonderful way of seeing it. So I would say maybe we could study together and study texts together, study our sacred text together, and to see these parts of the world together as well. And when it's the right time to go to take broad-based trips to these places like Nazareth or Bethlehem or Jerusalem, and to see who's there now, and to see and to problematize or to bring a sense of perspective to the truths that we tell each other and the truths that we tell ourselves in order to keep ourselves rooted in an uncertain world.
I think that would be amazing to see more of is Jewish peoples and people who call themselves Christians to read read the sacred texts together, because quite honestly, we don't know what we don't know, right? I mean, we all have our own cultural blind spots when we come to the text. And so to be able to learn in community with one another, I think, what an incredible and beautiful thing to do. So yes and amen to that.
One of the great opportunities I had a few years ago, and I also teach at the Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, is to study the book of Exodus with my good and dear friend, Reverend Dr. Daryl Horton, who's the senior pastor of Mount Zion.
Good friend.
Oh, great. So Daryl and I are good friends, and to study the book of Exodus, specifically the story of the enslavement narrative to freedom, which is something that the Jewish people, it's kind of our big deal, that movement into freedom. It's our Passover story. But to hear it and study it is exactly as you're saying from Dr. Horton's perspective, and to hear how that lifted up African-American traditions and inspired others. It was just, in many ways, metaversian, kind of like, wow, you're reading the same text that I'm reading, really? And really inspiring and hopeful to see how the life of this is so much more multiplied than what even I can offer it. So yes, more please.
Yes.
All right, thank you very much, both of you, and I love this conversation. So I have a question this is from Cecily here. It says, faith leaders clearly have important roles to play in addressing racism. What would you suggest ordinary congregation members do?
Is that for either one of us or both of us, or?
Yeah, I'm assuming for both of you in your respective roles, yeah.
Dr. Reyes, do you want to start?
Sure. I think there's two pieces. There's certainly an educational piece, in terms of growing in our awareness of other people's histories, of other people's pain points, but also of other people's heroes, the successes and achievements of other communities as well. But it is interesting that after 2020, and as people sort of collectively began growing in their racial consciousness after the murder of George Floyd, there was also this realization that awareness was not enough. There was now this whole collective of people that had read all the books, right? They had done the Be the Bridge group, and they had read Jamar Tisby's Color of Compromise and all these sorts of things, and had then sort of self-declared that they were racially conscious, anti-racism, pro-social justice folks. And yet the reality was that many of these voices were simply armchair social justice warriors. They were folks in their homes who were posting quotes on social media and nothing more. And so on the one hand, education and awareness is important. It's why so many conversations are about what books are on your bookshelf. Who are you learning from? Who are you being formed by? That's an incredibly important piece of the puzzle, if you will. But at the same time, without relationships, it's all for naught. And I think even in the context of churches, in the midst of these past 2 years, churches and Christians, folks just wanting to do something. We want to help. We want to, we finally realize racism exists and it's a problem. What do we do? And I think too often there's this knee-jerk reaction to just throw money at an organization to try to help a community in a way that you think is best, but you haven't actually gone and talked to that community. And there's, I think, oftentimes this assumption in Black and Brown communities that there aren't leaders already doing the work, that there aren't people on the ground who understand their people. And so these outside communities, outside orgs, outside leaders step in and try to reinvent the wheel. And so, this is why we must live proximate to the pain and suffering in this world. This is why we must be building. If you really want to care for the Jewish community, how many Jewish friends do you have? If you truly want to care for the Asian community, are you living in proximity to fellow Asian Americans? Are you having conversations about what they're experiencing and listening to their pain, suffering with them, and letting them take the lead about expressing what they need, and then seeking to serve in that way versus just sort of being in this void, to use the words of Rabbi Blumofe, of just sort of sitting in a boardroom and coming up with ideas of what we think is best for some other community, as opposed to sitting under the voices and teaching of the leaders in that community. So on the one hand, educate, learn, grow. We must all be continual students and learning about other peoples and the history of race and racism. And at the same time, build relationships, one person at a time, real, deep, authentic relationships where we're getting to know people's stories, their pain points, their heroes, their joys, and truly living in community, because that's how we begin to truly care for each other's burdens.
I think there's a lot of wisdom there. I would just add just a few things, just three boundaries for us too. There's one thing we hadn't really spoken about. We can easily get the impression after tonight that we're going to go do everything for everybody. And I really want us to acknowledge, give ourselves permission to be tired and to have fatigue, and to realize that these are very, very intense, complex, huge issues, and to recognize that we're not going to necessarily solve them all. On the rare occasions when I go into the candy store and try to fill my basket as quickly as possible, the understanding that we must sort of allow ourselves a chance of what we would call in my tradition, tzimtzum, or of consciously getting out of our own way, of recognizing, what can we really work on realistically that allows us to continue the life that we have. And number two, to practice humility and to do exactly, I think, as Dr. Reyes is suggesting, to let others help us, guide us, form us, and direct us. And yet number three is to have curiosity, is to be curious about what's going on in Austin, in the world, and to get involved and to see and notice where you are being moved to. There are many wonderful organizations in Austin, specifically, if that's where you're coming from. The Interfaith Action of Central Texas, IACT, is an organization that is a preeminent interfaith group that does some really great work and convenes conversations. And they have monthly conversations called the Red Bench, where people of different faiths and no faiths get together to discuss issues that are very important to all of us. So in addition to seeking out friendships like, well, how do I do that? Where do I go? Ask your religious leader and ask them to model for you. One of the great accomplishments, certainly in my community, is my personal friendship with Dr. Horton and some members of my community and some members of his church who have formed over years relationships, respectful educational opportunities. And that's not something I said, you all need to go do this. It's something that happened organically because of what they saw us doing, taking road trips together, spending a lot of time together. And that's really teaching classes together. And that's really important. Know your limits, to recognize that we are only as a certain group or a certain amount of time that we have, and to not apologize for that, and to continue to be curious and to seek out organizations that are already doing some of this important work of bringing people together. Texas Impact is another group. Interfaith Austin is another group. There's a lot of great groups out there doing this work. So keep in touch, and if you're interested, interfaithtexas.org is a great place to start.
Yeah, thank you so much for making those references, Rabbi Blumofe. And another question from the audience. So throughout the conversation tonight, I think all of you in your own ways have talked about religion coming up as a challenge or as an obstacle to racial justice in certain ways. And certainly I think racial justice can be a difficult topic to bring into a religious context as well. And so the listener just wants to know, why is that the case? And I might also add, what can we do about that?
Well, I think there's a lot of directions one could go. I would just say, I think, just to defend and appreciate religion for a second, because I'm kind of a big fan, is that it helps us to understand some of the essential questions of our life. What is our meaning? What is our purpose? How am I in relationship? What is my life about? And because those are so important and essential questions for us, whether you want to call it religion or ritual or spirituality or a particular faith, I think it's so tied up in our sense of who we are. And racial reckoning or racial reconciliation is such a fraught and important and complex issue for many of us, depending on where we stand. I think it gets caught up and it pulls on our strings to the point where we begin to second guess who we are in the first place. And to have a spiritual crisis is something that I think is common to many, but to have it exacerbated by the good work that we're supposed to be thinking that we're supposed to be doing is also important too. I can only comment on my own faith, my own religion. Judaism has a tremendous social justice tradition to it, and yet it is tied to particular texts. So I would say that, at least going back to some of the earlier conversations and the earlier questions, maybe there's a way for people to convene conversations across faiths or traditions where we do look at our social justice texts and begin to formulate a sense of common knowledge, a common respect, and a way forward. And I think that's really important. To do it detached from that, I think is opening ourselves up for a sense of the wilderness path, which can be very frightening to many of us.
Yeah, and I'll just say briefly, in addition to that, it was in fact, and I'm speaking again from my context as a Christian, that it was in studying the church fathers and in studying certain passages in scripture that I first learned, understood, began to care for this notion of justice, of a big biblical justice, and what it means to holistically care for people and seek the restoration of all things. And so I think it's also important to make the distinction between what the Bible actually says about loving all peoples and loving your neighbor, loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself, and seeking to care for the brokenness in the world, and making the distinction between that and how certain people have interpreted scripture and how they're living it out and wielding the Bible as a tool, weaponizing the Bible as a tool to create division and hate amongst one another. And while I still have to make the claim, these are my brothers and sisters, and so I am in this trying to figure out how do I lovingly call out, my brothers and sisters, and say this is actually not what Scripture says. How do I, in the vein of Scripture itself, take responsibility for what other people who profess the name of Jesus are doing, and say they've created this mess, and because they are my brothers and sisters, I'm going to figure out a way to help clean up this mess. But at its core, the ways in which we see some very vocal Christians spewing hate and divisiveness in so many different directions is not what Scripture says. And so I think, as Rabbi Blumofe shared as well, there's a moral compass to our sacred texts that if we were truly living that out, the world would be a better place. And so that's the goal, is how to live more into this vision.
And I would just thank you. You've inspired me to think about a couple of other things just quickly. Is that just to be able to do something social action-y or social justice-y once a month is lovely, but it becomes a practice like anything else. And I think religion can help one sustain that practice. It's a marathon, or it's an ultra marathon, if you will. And to be able to continue to show up, to continue to be inspired by other like-minded folks who have your back. And from there, you can go to places of interest and curiosity and seek out other people and do things with other people to help the greater community. The beloved community is a blessing. Just the one thing that I want to mention, because I get to say this all the time, and it's really important, the Hebrew words tikkun olam, which means to repair the world. That is literally repairing the world. And the mystics translated people, as you're repairing the world, as Dr. Reyes just intimated, you're actually repairing yourself. There's an internal repair that is going on as you're repairing outside. And it's not just giving to others. You're helping yourself become whole as you reach out to others. And in my own misery or in my own difficulty, the way that I help myself to take care of myself is to help other people, because that puts my circumstances into perspective.